Throughout history, no empire has left such a deep and lasting mark as the British Empire. From a small island in the North Atlantic emerged a power capable of extending its flag over 5 continents and dominating the seas for more than 3 centuries. It was the empire on which the sun never set, a giant that shaped the trade, politics, language, and culture of the modern world. Its story is that of a nation that, thanks to its fleet, its industry, and its ambition, transformed the global map forever. It all began with sailors and merchants, names like Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, and James Cook, who braved unknown oceans in search of new routes, riches, and territories. From small colonies in America and the Caribbean, Britain went on to control vast regions in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Introduction: the birth of a maritime empire. At the dawn of the 16th century, England was nothing more than a European island with uncertain ambitions. Its political power was still limited by the shadow of continental powers such as Spain and France, and its trade consisted largely of exporting wool and textiles to Flanders. However, the sea, that ever-open horizon, was beginning to awaken in the Tudor monarchs a new form of power. The ocean would become both the means and the symbol of the future empire. The reign of Henry VIII marked the turning point. In a world dominated by Spanish and Portuguese naval supremacy, England realized that the wealth of the future did not lie in the fields but in the trade routes and overseas colonies. To compete with the Iberian empires, Henry founded a permanent navy, a royal force that replaced the improvised fleets of nobles and merchants. Its purpose was twofold: to protect England's coasts and to open the way for maritime commerce. The shipyards of Deptford and Portsmouth began building galleons with innovations in design and artillery, while British navigators carefully studied the maps drawn by the Portuguese of the newly discovered world. But it was under his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, that England decisively set sail into the ocean. Her reign coincided with the rise of crown-sponsored piracy, a phenomenon that blended ambition, religion, and greed. In a context where Spain dominated the seas with silver from the New World, Elizabeth found in privateers an effective tool to challenge that monopoly. Captains such as Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher became legends by raiding Spanish galleons and bringing to England the American gold that fueled its wars and economy. The line between explorer and pirate became blurred, and the Queen, with a diplomatic smile, denied all involvement while counting the coins in her treasury. Maritime trade turned into state policy. In 1562, Hawkins organized the first English expeditions dedicated to the slave trade, transporting Africans to the Caribbean, inaugurating a system that would later consolidate the Atlantic Triangle. England began to understand that control of the seas meant power and that commercial expansion was inseparable from naval dominance. London, still a medieval city, was slowly becoming the financial center of the Atlantic world. Exploratory voyages multiplied. In 1578, Francis Drake embarked on his circumnavigation of the globe, a journey that lasted 3 years and ended with his return laden with treasures looted from the Spanish in the Pacific. He was received as a hero and knighted by the Queen aboard his ship, the Golden Hind. England celebrated not only a triumph over its enemy but also a symbolic declaration. The seas, once ruled by the Catholic kingdoms, now belonged to the Protestants as well. Tensions with Spain reached their peak in 1588. Philip II, determined to punish England for its support of the Flemish rebels and the constant harassment of his fleets, organized the so-called Invincible Armada, a colossal fleet meant to invade the British Isles and restore Catholicism. Elizabeth responded with a message that would go down in history. "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The storms of the English Channel and the superior maneuverability of the English ships sealed the Spanish defeat. That episode, wrapped in myth and patriotic fervor, marked the symbolic birth of British maritime power. After the victory, English confidence multiplied. Routes toward North America, the Arctic, and the Far East began to be explored by figures such as Humphrey Gilbert and Walter Raleigh. Gilbert claimed Newfoundland for the crown in 1583, while Raleigh organized expeditions to what is now North Carolina, naming it Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen. These early attempts at colonization, though fragile and at times disastrous, planted the idea of a transoceanic empire under English control. At the beginning of the 17th century, with the rise of James I, the maritime drive became institutionalized. In 1600, Elizabeth had granted a royal charter to the British East India Company, marking the beginning of English trade with Asia. What began as a commercial enterprise would, over time, transform into a political power that dominated the Indian subcontinent. Simultaneously, other private companies, such as the Virginia Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, emerged with the purpose of founding colonies, exploring territories, and trading under the protection of the English flag. Naval power also acquired a scientific dimension. English cartographers began perfecting maps, shipyards improved vessel design with lighter structures and triangular sails, and naval artillery was standardized with cast-iron cannons. The Royal Navy became a permanent institution, capable of maintaining fleets in different parts of the world and ensuring control over trade routes. In parallel, maritime expansion was shaping a new national identity. England saw itself as a nation chosen to bring Protestant Christianity and civilization to the rest of the world, a rhetoric that justified both piracy and colonization. Poets and propagandists spoke of a divine mission, while merchants and adventurers saw in the sea the promise of wealth and personal glory. By the end of the 16th century, the world map was beginning to bear English marks. In North America, small colonies clung to the Atlantic coast. In the Caribbean, English privateers fought the Spanish for control. In West Africa, traders bought slaves to supply the plantations of the New World. And in Asia, the first English trading posts appeared in India and the Malay archipelago. The ocean, vast and merciless, had become the natural frontier of English power. From the coasts of Plymouth to the distant waters of the Indian Ocean, a new power was rising among the waves. It was not yet the British Empire, but its skeleton, forged from oak, cast iron, and ambition. The 16th century had transformed a modest island into a nation of sailors, merchants, and conquerors, convinced that the world belonged to them. The slave trade and the Atlantic Triangle. The power of the sea brought not only wealth, but also one of the darkest chapters in human history. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the British Empire became the main engine of the transatlantic slave trade, a system that linked 3 continents in a network of horror and economic profit. That triangle, formed by Europe, Africa, and America, sustained British expansion and turned its ports into the nerve centers of an empire built upon human bondage. It all began with the first incursions of John Hawkins in the 1560s. Approved by Queen Elizabeth I, Hawkins set sail for the coasts of West Africa, where he captured or purchased enslaved people from local traffickers and sold them in the Spanish colonies of the Caribbean. Although Spain officially forbade English trade in its territories, bribery and piracy kept the flow constant. Hawkins returned to England with enormous profits, and his example became a business model. From then on, the slave trade ceased to be an act of opportunity and became a systematic industry. British port cities grew rich in rhythm with that trade. Bristol, Liverpool, and London became the main departure and arrival points for thousands of voyages. Ships left England loaded with weapons, textiles, and manufactured goods. Upon reaching Africa, they exchanged these products for human beings captured by local kingdoms or Arab merchants. They then crossed the Atlantic in a hellish journey known as the Middle Passage. Finally, in the Americas, the enslaved were sold to work on plantations of sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The ships returned to England filled with these goods, thus closing the economic cycle of the Atlantic Triangle. The Middle Passage was an inhuman experience. In the holds of the slave ships, the captives were chained by the neck and wrists, packed tightly with no room or air. Many died of suffocation, disease, or despair. Mortality rates could exceed 20%. Those who survived arrived in the Caribbean or the North American colonies stripped of their identity, turned into property. The records of British companies, cold and meticulous, tell the story in numbers. More than 3 million Africans were transported on ships flying the British flag between the 17th and 19th centuries. The slave trade was not merely a maritime activity. It was an economic mechanism that sustained the entire empire. The great English families who amassed fortunes during this era did so thanks to sugar plantations in Jamaica and Barbados. The banks of London financed the expeditions, the insurance companies covered the risks of lost cargo, human beings included, and the shipyards of Bristol built the specialized vessels used for the trade. The Caribbean colonies became the most profitable in the world, surpassing even Britain's North American possessions in income. On the plantations, the lives of the enslaved were marked by unbearable heat, constant surveillance, and punishment. They worked from dawn until nightfall, cutting sugarcane or picking cotton under the watch of armed overseers. Rebellions were frequent and were repressed with brutality. Yet even within this system of absolute oppression, African culture survived, blending with European and Caribbean traditions to create new languages, religions, and cultural expressions. The British Parliament, aware of the profits, defended the trade as an imperial necessity. Privileged companies, such as the Royal African Company, founded in 1672 under the patronage of the Duke of York, the future King James II, monopolized the slave trade from West Africa for decades. The company operated with military support and established fortifications along the coast, in places like Cape Coast and Elmina, to protect its human cargo. In return, the state received taxes and a share of the profits. During the 18th century, the system reached its peak. British ports recorded hundreds of departures to Africa each year. Liverpool alone dispatched more than 100 slave ships annually. The British economy depended on Caribbean sugar, rum, Virginian tobacco, and cotton from the southern regions of North America. The fortunes that would later finance the Industrial Revolution had been forged on the shores of the enslaved Atlantic. Despite the economic success, voices of protest began to emerge from within the empire itself. Some religious figures and thinkers, such as John Wesley and Thomas Clarkson, denounced the barbarity of the system. In 1787, the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed, led by Member of Parliament William Wilberforce, who dedicated his life to the cause. The testimonies of former enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano began to circulate throughout England, revealing the real cruelty behind the numbers and profits. Moral pressure combined with an economic shift. The colonies were beginning to diversify, and the British economy no longer depended so heavily on enslaved labor. Moreover, the rebellions in Haiti and Jamaica had shown that the system could become uncontrollable. In 1807, after decades of debate, Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, which officially banned the slave trade throughout the British Empire. However, slavery itself was not abolished until 1833, and thousands of people continued to live in chains under other names: apprentices, servants, or indentured laborers. After abolition, the Royal Navy was given a new mission: to patrol the African coasts to intercept slave ships and free their captives. Between 1808 and 1870, the British fleet captured more than 1,000 vessels and liberated around 150,000 Africans. Yet this humanitarian work also served to justify a greater British presence in Africa, paving the way for 19th century colonialism. The Atlantic Triangle disappeared from the maps, but its consequences remained alive. The fortunes that financed London's banks, universities, and industries had their origin in that trade. The port cities prospered thanks to an ocean stained with pain. At the heart of the British Empire, prosperity and cruelty had become inseparable. The first colonies in America and the Caribbean. When English ships began crossing the Atlantic in search of their own place in the New World, the map of power was already drawn. Spain controlled most of Central and South America, Portugal, Brazil, and France had begun establishing settlements in the north. England, lagging behind in the colonial race, had to fight against both time and geography. What began as a series of private expeditions, backed by merchants and ambitious nobles, eventually laid the foundations of the first English colonial empire. The history of the British colonies in America officially began in 1607, when settlers from the Virginia Company founded Jamestown on the eastern coast of what is now the United States. It was not the first attempt. The colony of Roanoke, founded 2 decades earlier, had mysteriously disappeared, but it was the first to survive. That small settlement, surrounded by swamps and harassed by local tribes, nearly failed. Famine, disease, and conflicts with the Powhatan peoples decimated the colonists. However, the introduction of tobacco cultivation by John Rolfe changed Virginia's fate. The plant became the colony's economic foundation, and English tobacco began to flood European markets. The labor-intensive nature of tobacco farming spurred the massive importation of enslaved Africans, marking the beginning of the plantation economy that would define the British colonies. Meanwhile, further north, Puritans persecuted for their faith in England set sail in 1620 aboard the Mayflower. Their arrival on the shores of Massachusetts gave rise to the Plymouth Colony, the precursor of New England. Unlike Virginia, founded for commercial purposes, Plymouth was born as a self-sufficient religious community. These settlers drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement establishing principles of self-government and cooperation. Over time, this democratic tradition would profoundly influence the political thought of the future North American colonies. Over the following decades, England multiplied its settlements along the Atlantic coast. Colonies such as Maryland, North and South Carolina, Georgia, New York, and Pennsylvania emerged, each with distinct economic and religious characteristics. The Quakers of William Penn preached tolerance in Pennsylvania, while the southern colonies grew wealthy through the cultivation of rice, indigo, and cotton, sustained by enslaved labor. The diversity of climates, resources, and cultures turned North America into a colonial mosaic that expanded in step with trade and immigration. In the Caribbean, English expansion was even more lucrative and violent. By the mid-17th century, after expelling the Spanish from several islands, England consolidated its presence in Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, Montserrat, and other smaller islands. Barbados, colonized in 1627, became one of the empire's most profitable economies thanks to sugar cultivation. The plantations required vast amounts of labor, leading to the massive importation of enslaved Africans. Jamaica, seized from the Spanish in 1655, became another pillar of the Atlantic trade. From its ports, tons of sugar and rum were shipped to London and Bristol, while the ships returned with weapons, cloth, and manufactured goods. The Caribbean islands were also stages for European rivalries. The Anglo-Dutch and Anglo-French wars turned the region into a naval battlefield where privateers and pirates acted in the service of their crowns. The Royal Navy began establishing permanent bases in strategic ports, protecting trade routes and ensuring the constant flow of wealth to England. The Caribbean seas were a mirror of imperial power, cannons, slaves, and sugar intertwined in a single economic circuit. The political structure of the colonies remained ambiguous for much of the 17th century. Although they formally depended on the king, distance and communication difficulties fostered a high degree of autonomy. In North America, local assemblies and colonial governments began making their own decisions about taxes and laws. In the Caribbean, the planters, wealthy landowners who controlled the islands, acted almost like local monarchs, administering justice and commerce. This practical independence would in the future become the root of the tensions with the metropolis. The colonial boom coincided with a broader economic transformation, the birth of mercantilism. Under this doctrine, the colonies existed to benefit the mother country. The Navigation Acts, imposed by Oliver Cromwell in 1651 and reinforced by Charles II, forbade colonial goods from being transported on foreign ships. Only English vessels could trade with the colonies, thus guaranteeing the monopoly of imperial commerce. Although these measures strengthened England's navy and industry, they also sowed resentment among the colonists, who found themselves restricted to trading exclusively with England. The rivalry among the European colonial powers defined the fate of those first colonies. France established its own empire in Canada and Louisiana, while Spain held its ground in the south. The wars between these empires spread to the American continent. During the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763, the British, led by William Pitt the Elder, managed to defeat the French and take control of Canada and much of their Caribbean possessions. The Treaty of Paris of 1763 marked a turning point. Great Britain emerged as the dominant colonial power in North America. That triumph, however, would come at an unexpected cost. To finance the wars, London imposed new taxes on the American colonies, unleashing a growing wave of discontent. The very ideas of liberty and self-government that had guided the Puritans of the Mayflower began to resurface among the colonists, now transformed into a political challenge against the crown. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, wealth continued to accumulate in British hands. Sugar was called white gold of the empire, and its profits fed the banks, industries, and the navy. Behind that prosperity, millions of African slaves continued to be exploited relentlessly under the tropical sun. The British colonial economy had become consolidated, its roots stretching from the coasts of Africa to the plantations of the Caribbean and the colonies of North America. By the late 18th century, the British colonial map of the Atlantic displayed a network connecting 3 continents. From the ports of Liverpool and Bristol sailed the ships that carried goods and returned with wealth. The colonies produced, traded, and fought in the name of an empire whose limits were not yet defined, but which was already beginning to see itself as the natural master of the sea. The 13 colonies of the North and the Caribbean islands were the laboratory of an expansion model that would soon be replicated in Asia and Africa, extending British influence to every corner of the planet. The consolidation of naval power. In the 17th century, as the colonial map expanded, England realized that its true power depended not so much on the territories it conquered as on the seas that connected them. The ocean became the axis of its identity, and the Royal Navy the backbone of the nascent empire. In a world where trade, war, and diplomacy were waged upon the water, control of the sea was equivalent to control of the world. The reign of the Stuarts coincided with the process of professionalizing the English Navy. Under James I and Charles I, new naval laws were enacted and shipyards were modernized. The warship ceased to be a simple armed vessel and became a precision machine. English naval engineers perfected the design of the Elizabethan galleon, incorporating lower and more stable structures and distributing cannons across multiple decks, which improved both firepower and maneuverability. The true leap came with the rise to power of Oliver Cromwell after the English Civil War. Cromwell understood that the nation's future depended on the seas and launched an ambitious program of naval expansion. Under his rule, the Navigation Act of 1651 was enacted, prohibiting foreign nations from trading with the English colonies unless the goods were transported in English or colonial-built ships. The law sought to strike at Dutch commerce, which at that time dominated European trade routes. The result was a series of maritime conflicts between England and the United Provinces, known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, which marked the definitive rise of English naval power. During those wars, the English Navy developed a new tactic, the line of battle. Instead of chaotic skirmishes, ships would align one behind another, firing their broadsides in unison. This innovation, combined with the disciplined training of officers and sailors, gave England a decisive advantage in naval engagements. The battles off Texel and Lowestoft demonstrated that the Royal Navy could stand toe-to-toe with the most advanced maritime powers of Europe. After the monarchical restoration, Charles II continued Cromwell's legacy and turned the Navy into a permanent institution of the state. In 1660, the Admiralty Board was established as the body in charge of naval administration, and schools for officers and technical training programs were created. The royal shipyards, such as those of Portsmouth, Chatham, and Deptford, worked tirelessly, building larger and more resilient ships. Each vessel was a symbol of power, but also a feat of engineering that required oak wood, iron, tar, linen, and dozens of specialized trades. During the 18th century, the Royal Navy not only protected the empire's trade routes, but also expanded them. Its mission was twofold: to defend the British colonies and to ensure that no other power could block the flow of goods. The Atlantic Ocean became an imperial highway controlled by warships and merchant convoys. In the ports of London and Bristol, traffic was constant. Sugar, tobacco, tea, cotton, and slaves passed from one continent to another under the watchful eye of the British flag. Naval power also played a crucial role in the European wars. During the War of the Spanish Succession, between 1701 and 1714, the British Navy defeated the combined fleets of France and Spain, securing for England control of Gibraltar, a strategic base at the entrance of the Mediterranean. From then on, Gibraltar became one of the most valuable jewels of the empire, allowing the British to oversee the passage between the Atlantic and the Mare Nostrum. British maritime supremacy was not only military but also geographical. Its bases formed a global network that connected the routes of imperial commerce. With the expansion of naval power came a distinct culture within the Navy. Life aboard ships was harsh and disciplined. Sailors, often recruited by force through the press gang system, spent months at sea, subjected to severe punishments and extreme conditions. Yet, national pride and the sense of belonging to an invincible force often compensated for the hardships. The Navy was not merely an instrument of war, but a symbol of British identity. During the reigns of George II and George III, the Royal Navy reached its institutional maturity. The introduction of the rating system, which classified ships according to their size and number of guns, standardized the fleet. The great ships of the line, carrying between 64 and 100 cannons, became the backbone of British naval power. Meanwhile, lighter and faster frigates were used for exploration, patrol, and convoy escort. Each ship was a microcosm of the empire. Aristocratic officers, sailors from different colonies, African or Indian cooks, all under the command of the admiral and the flag of St. George. The 18th century was also the age of the great admirals. Figures such as Edward Vernon, George Anson, and later Horatio Nelson embodied the ideal of the British maritime hero. Anson, in his circumnavigation voyage between 1740 and 1744, plundered Spanish colonies in the Pacific and demonstrated the Navy's global reach. Nelson, decades later, would become a legend in the battles of Aboukir and Trafalgar. The Battle of Trafalgar, fought in 1805 off the Spanish coast, definitively consolidated British naval supremacy. Nelson, facing the combined fleets of France and Spain, achieved an overwhelming victory, destroying more than 20 enemy ships without losing a single one of his own. Though the admiral was killed during the battle, his triumph secured Britain's command of the seas for more than a century. The consequence of that supremacy was the creation of a maritime empire without precedent. No nation could trade, expand, or wage war without considering Britain's presence on the oceans. From the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, the Royal Navy protected London's interests, kept trade routes open, and ensured the steady flow of raw materials to the mother country. The loss of the 13 colonies and the expansion toward Asia. The second half of the 18th century brought with it a paradox for Great Britain. The most powerful empire of the Atlantic was facing rebellion from its own colonies. For decades, the 13 colonies in North America had grown under British protection, benefiting from trade, naval defense, and a relative degree of political autonomy. However, after the 7 Years' War, the balance between the metropolis and its colonies began to fracture. Victory over France in 1763 had left Great Britain with a vast empire, but also with a colossal debt. London decided that the colonies should help pay it, and thus the spark of independence was lit. The Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed taxes on documents, newspapers, and licenses, sparked the first protests. It was followed by the Townshend Acts and the Tea Act, which the colonists perceived as a direct attack on their freedom. No taxation without representation became their battle cry. Tensions escalated in incidents such as the Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when a group of colonists threw shipments of British tea into the sea as a sign of protest. London's response was harsh. The closure of Boston Harbor and the imposition of punitive laws known as the Coercive Acts. The rebellion turned into open war in 1775 with the clashes at Lexington and Concord. A year later, the colonies proclaimed their independence through the Declaration of July 4, 1776, written by Thomas Jefferson and signed by representatives of the 13 colonies. The ensuing conflict, the American War of Independence, was more than a military struggle. It was an ideological confrontation between the liberty of peoples and imperial control. Great Britain, confident in its naval and economic superiority, underestimated the determination of the rebels. Although British forces won several early battles, their ability to maintain control weakened over time. Distance, logistical costs, and the growing support of France for the insurgents tipped the balance. The surrender at Yorktown in 1781 marked the effective end of the war. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, officially recognized the independence of the United States. The loss of the 13 colonies was a moral and political blow without precedent. In London, many believed that the imperial dream had come to an end. However, British pragmatism turned defeat into opportunity. If the Atlantic no longer offered the absolute control that once guaranteed wealth, the eyes of the empire had to turn eastward, toward lands where trade and conquest intertwined along new routes of expansion. Africa, India, and the Pacific emerged as the new horizons of British power. Eastern trade had already begun to flourish since the 17th century thanks to the British East India Company, but after the American loss, its role expanded dramatically. London saw in Asia an inexhaustible source of spices, tea, silk, and cotton. The ports of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay became vital enclaves, governed more like protectorates than mere trading posts. From there, the British extended their political and military influence, taking advantage of the internal rivalries of the Indian subcontinent to subdue local princes. The booming British industrial economy found in India an ideal market, a place to sell manufactured goods and obtain cheap raw materials. Indian cotton fed the looms of Manchester, and the tea of Assam and Ceylon arrived in London's ports as a symbol of national refinement. This new imperial orientation was not only commercial but also cultural. In the British mindset, Asia represented the future, a space of economic opportunity but also of a supposed civilizing mission. Meanwhile, Africa acquired a strategic role. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 did not halt British expansion on the continent, it transformed it. The western coasts, from Sierra Leone to the Gulf of Guinea, were occupied under the pretext of suppressing the slave trade and establishing legitimate commercial posts. These enclaves would later serve as bases for the exploration of the interior and for later colonization. In the Pacific, British ambition stretched even farther. In 1770, Captain James Cook claimed the eastern coast of Australia for King George III, and only a few years later, in 1788, the first penal colony was founded in Botany Bay, today's Sydney. Ships transported convicts from English prisons to the remote Australian shores, inaugurating a system of colonization that combined punishment, commerce, and territorial expansion. The Pacific Islands, New Zealand, Fiji, and Tahiti, soon began receiving British missionaries, traders, and sailors who established the first formal contacts with oceanic cultures. The imperial reorientation toward Asia and the Pacific coincided with an ideological shift within Great Britain. If the 18th century had been marked by Atlantic trade and colonization, the 19th would be the age of industrial capitalism and global hegemony. London became the financial center of the world, and the naval power, strengthened after the victory at Trafalgar, could ensure control of maritime routes. The colonies were no longer merely sources of wealth, but components of a planetary economy serving British interests. The loss of America also changed the way the empire saw itself. It was no longer about reproducing a version of England overseas, as in the North American colonies, but about ruling and exploiting territories without fully integrating them. This new model of domination was based on indirect administration, cooperation with local elites, and the imposition of commercial structures that benefited the metropolis. The British Empire left behind its pioneering colonial phase to become a complex and hierarchical imperial system. In Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, British officers became diplomats, merchants, and conquerors all at once. The Union Jack, the national emblem of the United Kingdom, flew over fortresses, factories, and temples turned into seats of imperial power. The sea remained the vital artery of the system, but territorial expansion was gaining increasing prominence. The world map began to turn red, the color used to represent British dominions. The British East India Company. The history of the British Empire in Asia cannot be understood without the British East India Company, a corporation that began as a commercial enterprise and ended up governing an entire subcontinent. Its existence spanned more than 2 centuries, during which it became the most powerful symbol of British imperial capitalism. A private corporation with its own army, its own currency, and the authority to sign treaties, conquer territories, and administer justice. Founded in 1600 under a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, the company was granted the exclusive right to trade with the East Indies, the general name Europeans used for Asia and its archipelagos. In its early years, it competed with the powerful Dutch and Portuguese trading companies, which already controlled much of the spice trade in the Indian Ocean. Its first voyages were precarious. Long crossings from London to the coasts of India, Java, or Sumatra, where captains had to negotiate permissions and establish factories or small trading enclaves, often under hostile conditions. Initial success came through agreements with local princes. In 1613, the company obtained authorization from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir to establish a factory in Surat on India's western coast. From there, it expanded its presence to Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, which would become its 3 main centers of operation. In these ports, the British built fortresses, warehouses, and offices, surrounded by walls and cannons that symbolized the union between commerce and military power. During the 17th century, the company was not only an economic force, it also represented a new model of imperialism. Its internal structure mirrored the British political order. A board of directors in London made the key decisions, while the governors in Asia acted as de facto viceroys. The goal was clear: to control the trade of strategic goods such as spices, cotton, silk, saltpeter, and tea, and to monopolize the maritime routes. The profits were immense, and the British government, though theoretically separate, benefited from the taxes and the global influence that the company conferred upon it. The 18th century completely transformed its role. As the Mughal Empire weakened, the company shifted from being a commercial actor to becoming a political and military power. The decisive moment came with the Battle of Plassey in 1757, in which the British governor Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, with the help of Indian troops and strategic bribes. That victory marked the beginning of British rule over India. Bengal, one of the richest regions on earth, came under the company's control, which began to collect taxes and administer justice as though it were a sovereign government. With territorial expansion came the consolidation of the company's army, composed mostly of Indian soldiers known as sepoys, led by British officers. By the late 18th century, this army outnumbered that of Britain itself. The wars against the French and the Marathas, members of India's state order, consolidated British power across the subcontinent. The company's flag flew from the mountains of the Punjab to the shores of the Bay of Bengal. But conquest brought abuse. The company imposed a tax system that drained the peasantry and monopolized agricultural production. Famines multiplied, especially in Bengal, where more than 10 million people died in 1770. Meanwhile, the fortunes of British officers and merchants grew without limit. London began to worry. The company's private power threatened to surpass that of the state itself. Corruption, intrigue, and public denunciations led the British Parliament to intervene. In 1773, the Regulating Act imposed governmental oversight over the company's activities and created the office of Governor-General of India, held by Warren Hastings, who sought to reorganize colonial administration. Even so, the abuses continued. Financial scandals and internal conflicts between directors and officials in Asia fueled the debate over the company's role within the empire. At the beginning of the 19th century, the company expanded its dominion beyond India. It established enclaves in Singapore, Burma, Malacca, and Hong Kong, turning Asian trade into an interconnected system under British influence. Its control of the tea trade with China generated a new source of wealth, but also of conflict. To balance trade with the Qing Empire, the British began illegally introducing opium produced in India. Mass addiction in China and imperial repression triggered the Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856, which ended with China's defeat and the cession of Hong Kong to Britain. These victories reinforced the myth of British invincibility, but also accelerated the decline of the company. In 1857, a rebellion erupted among the sepoys of the colonial army. The conflict, known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, began as a protest over the use of cartridges greased with animal fat, contrary to Hindu and Muslim beliefs, but soon escalated into a general uprising against British rule. Entire cities were razed, and the subsequent repression was brutal. The 1857 uprising marked the final turning point. In 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act, which officially dissolved the East India Company and transferred all its territories, armies, and functions to the Crown Government. Thus was born the British Raj, the direct governance of India under the authority of the monarch. The Industrial Revolution and Imperial Capitalism. While the East India Company extended British power in Asia, a silent transformation was reshaping the very heart of the empire. In the cities of England, artisan workshops were being replaced by factories. Rural villages became industrial centres, and coal, iron, and steam became the new weapons of global domination. The Industrial Revolution, emerging in the last decades of the 18th century, not only altered the British economy, but also redefined the concept of empire and gave Britain unprecedented technological supremacy. The change began in northern England, in regions such as Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the Midlands, where mechanization of the textile industry multiplied production on a scale never seen before. Spinning machines, such as James Hargreaves' spinning jenny or Edmund Cartwright's power loom, transformed the work of thousands of labourers. Cotton from India or American plantations was processed in Manchester, turned into textiles, and exported across the globe. Factories were built along rivers and later near railway lines, powered by the constant noise of steam engines. The engineer James Watt, with his refinement of the steam engine in 1769, revolutionized energy. Locomotives, ships, pumps, and factories depended on his invention. Within a few years, England had shifted from manual to industrial production. The figures spoke for themselves. Iron production doubled, coal mining multiplied, and foreign trade grew exponentially. London, Liverpool, and Glasgow became gateways to the industrialized world. This growth was sustained not only by technology but also by a global network of colonies that provided raw materials and markets. India, stripped of its traditional textile industry, became a supplier of cotton and a captive consumer of British manufactured goods. The Caribbean and Africa supplied sugar, timber, and minerals, while ports in the Pacific and Indian Oceans served as stops for new steamships crossing the globe. British capitalism not only needed to dominate the seas, it needed to control production and consumption on every continent. Banking and finance became pillars of the new empire. The creation of the Bank of England, the development of maritime insurance at Lloyd's, and the rise of joint stock companies made a global economy based on credit and investment possible. The risks of colonial expeditions were replaced by the scientific planning of trade. Every ship, factory, and mine was part of a financial mechanism centered in London. The Industrial Revolution also changed British social structure. Cities grew at a dizzying pace, with working-class neighborhoods where poverty coexisted with factory chimneys. While the landowning aristocracy retained political power, a new class, known as the industrial bourgeoisie, emerged as the dominant force. Entrepreneurs, engineers, and bankers drove imperial expansion, convinced that economic progress justified global domination. The British state, aware that the economy and the empire were inseparable, adapted its policies. Free trade became the new national doctrine. In 1846, the repeal of the Corn Laws marked the triumph of economic liberalism over protectionism. The motto was simple: let British products circulate freely across the world. The Royal Navy ensured that no rival could interrupt that circulation. Trade had become the modern form of power. Innovations in transportation and communication consolidated British supremacy. In 1825, the world's first railway line was inaugurated, between Stockton and Darlington. Shortly after, a network of trains covered all of Britain and extended to the colonies. Steamships reduced ocean crossings from months to weeks, and submarine telegraph cables connected continents under a single flow of information. The empire was administered through invisible lines of communication, linking London with Calcutta, Cape Town, and Hong Kong. The Industrial Revolution also altered the global balance of power. Other powers, such as France, Germany, and the United States, began to industrialize following the British model, which had established itself as the path to modern, technologically progressive, and expansive civilization. Yet, for much of the 19th century, Britain maintained an overwhelming advantage. It was the workshop of the world, a title earned by exporting not only value-added products, but also ideas. Capitalism, parliamentarism, and the model of the liberal state. Its engineers designed railways in India, its bankers financed projects in South America, and its ships transported coal to every corner of the globe. Progress, however, came at a cost. Worker exploitation, child labor, and pollution marked urban life in a period remembered as the age of hot beds, as families lived in overcrowded housing, and when adults went to work, children returned from work to sleep. In this context, unions emerged from misery, strikes multiplied, and the labor movement began organizing to demand basic rights. Despite this, the political class viewed imperial expansion as the solution to internal tensions. The colonies offered cheap raw materials and markets for surplus production, keeping the economic cycle in motion. Abroad, British industrialization transformed warfare. Steel replaced bronze in cannons, wooden ships gave way to ironclads, and railways allowed rapid troop movements. The combination of economic power and technological superiority made the British Army and Navy instruments of total dominance. In Asia, Africa, and Oceania, no kingdom could resist the imperial machinery for long. By the mid-19th century, the United Kingdom produced nearly half of the world's coal and iron. Its textiles dominated the markets of America and Asia. Its financial capital supported the development of entire countries. The British flag flew over ports, mines and railways connecting a planetary empire. Industrial capitalism had transformed the ambition for conquest into a global economic system with Britain as its center of gravity. The 19th century, the empire on which the sun never sets. During the 19th century, the British Empire reached its greatest extent and power. The phrase that resonated in London, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," was not a metaphor but a literal description. From the Canadian coasts to the Indian plains, from the mines of South Africa to the ports of Australia, there was always territory under British rule bathed in daylight. It was the Victorian era, a period of expansion, national pride, and deep contradictions where the ideal of progress coexisted with the reality of colonialism. Britain's victory in the Napoleonic Wars between 1799 and 1815 marked the beginning of its global supremacy. With the defeat of France, the last major European rival capable of challenging its maritime hegemony disappeared. The Royal Navy became the arbiter of the seas and ensured the security of trade routes. By 1815, Britain controlled over 100 colonies, protectorates and naval bases. From this system of domination emerged the so-called Pax Britannica, a century of relative global stability maintained by British power and trade. The Victorian Empire was organized under a precise economic logic. Colonies were to provide raw materials and consume British industrial products. From India came cotton, tea and spices. From Canada, timber and wheat. From Africa, minerals. And from Australia, wool and gold. In return, factories in Manchester, Sheffield and Birmingham flooded the world with textiles, tools and machinery. London, transformed into the financial center of the planet, regulated global trade prices, while its banks and insurers extended credit to foreign governments and private companies. Imperial expansion was also political. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, a symbol of a dominion seen not only as economic but also civilizational. The discourse of imperial duty justified conquest under the idea of bringing British modernity and morality to the backward peoples of the world. Poets, politicians and missionaries spoke of a divine mission to civilize, evangelize and organize the planet under the values of the empire. The Victorian era was, at the same time, deeply moralistic and brutally expansionist. Industrialization had given Britain unprecedented power. Steamships, railways, and the telegraph reduced distances between London and the farthest reaches of the empire. A message could cross the Atlantic in minutes, and a ship could reach India in weeks instead of months. These innovations not only facilitated trade but also political control. Submarine telegraph cables laid from the 1850s onward connected the colonies with the imperial centre, allowing the British government to monitor every corner of its vast dominion. Imperialism also acquired a cultural dimension. The English language spread across all continents. Colonial universities taught British values, and legal and administrative systems replicated the Westminster model. In the more developed colonies, such as Canada, Australia or New Zealand, local parliaments and constitutions were created under the form of dominions, recognizing the authority of the British monarch. In Asia and Africa, however, control was direct and authoritarian, administered by governors and viceroys. The 19th century was also an era of great exploration. British scientists, geographers and adventurers traveled through unknown regions in the name of knowledge and empire. Men like David Livingstone in Africa, Richard Burton in Arabia, and Robert Falcon Scott in Antarctica embodied the spirit of Victorian expansion. Behind their journeys were strategic interests, trade routes, natural resources, and the assertion of British power against other European powers. The empire also adapted to political changes in the century. In Europe, the independence of Greece, liberal revolutions, and the unification of Germany and Italy altered the continental balance. Britain, however, maintained its distance, preferring to dominate through diplomacy and economics. Its land army was relatively small, but its navy could project power anywhere in the world. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842, after the First Opium War, and the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 after the Second, consolidated British commercial dominance in China. Hong Kong and Shanghai became British enclaves, where Western capitalism flourished under the shadow of cannon fire. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire was a planetary system. Its influence extended even to regions not directly colonized. Latin America, although independent for decades, depended on British credit and investment. Argentine railways, Brazilian ports, and Chilean mines were financed with London capital. The empire did not need to conquer to dominate. Controlling money, trade routes, and markets was sufficient. Yet splendor also hid tensions. Colonies suffered inequality, exploitation, and institutionalized racism. In India, peasant misery contrasted sharply with the opulence of British officials. In Africa, the first colonial expeditions displaced entire peoples. Even within the United Kingdom, urban poverty and labor struggles showed that progress was not universal. Socialist ideas and reformist movements began to challenge the foundations of imperial capitalism. The empire reached its apex around 1870, when its domains covered about a quarter of the Earth's surface and governed over 400 million people. No power had ever reached such magnitude. However, at that very moment, new competitors were emerging. Germany and the United States began accelerated industrialization, and France was rebuilding its colonial empire. British hegemony, although still undisputed, began to face the first signs of change. By the end of the 19th century, London was the heart of an interconnected world, an unrivaled financial, industrial, and cultural centre. British flags flew over ports, fortresses, and railways. Coins bearing the Queen's effigy circulated from the Cape of Good Hope to Hong Kong. Yet this vastness also contained a silent fragility. An empire that, though it seemed eternal, depended on a delicate balance between trade, force, and obedience. At the height of its glory, the British Empire already carried within it the seeds of its future transformation. The Empire in Africa. In the 19th century, Africa became the new stage for British expansion. The continent, until then barely explored by European powers, sparked fierce interest with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. Its lands offered gold, diamonds, ivory, rubber, cotton, and minerals necessary to fuel the machinery of capitalism. In this global competition for resources, Britain aimed to control the African map from north to south, drawing a red line connecting Egypt to the Cape. British presence in Africa began before the formal partition of the continent. In the 18th century, the Royal Navy patrolled the western coasts to suppress the slave trade, but also to establish trading posts. Sierra Leone, founded in 1787 as a refuge for freed slaves, became a strategic outpost in West Africa. Further south, at the Cape, the British had replaced the Dutch in 1806, controlling the gateway between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. From there, Africa became a geopolitical chessboard where economy, religion, and imperial politics intertwined. The 19th century was the age of explorers. Names like David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and John Hanning Speke appeared in British newspapers as modern heroes. Livingstone, a missionary and doctor, explored the heart of the continent in search of the Nile's sources, while preaching against slavery and in favor of legitimate trade. His disappearance in Central Africa and subsequent meeting with Stanley in 1871 became a Victorian myth. Yet behind the epic tales, these expeditions paved the way for colonial enterprises, preparing the ground for conquest. The real partition of Africa began with the Berlin Conference of 1884, convened by Otto von Bismarck to regulate colonial competition among European powers. There, without African representation, arbitrary borders were drawn, dividing the continent into spheres of influence. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal divided entire territories with a pen on the map. The United Kingdom obtained vast regions of eastern and southern Africa, consolidating a dominion that would soon stretch from Egypt to the Cape of Good Hope. In the north, British interest focused on Egypt, the gateway to the Suez Canal, inaugurated in 1869. The canal was the empire's lifeline, reducing travel between London and Bombay by weeks. In 1882, after a nationalist revolt against European control, British troops occupied Egypt under the pretext of restoring order. Although nominally still under Ottoman sovereignty, the country fell into British hands. From then on, control of the canal became a strategic priority, ensuring the connection between Europe and Asia. Further south, British expansion advanced in East Africa. Kenya and Uganda became protectorates, driven by the construction of the Uganda Railway, which linked the Indian Ocean to the continent's interior. The train transported not only goods, but also European settlers and soldiers. In Central Africa, the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes, extended Crown territories inland. Rhodes, a businessman and politician, dreamed of a continuous British Empire from the Cape to Cairo. Under his leadership, the company conquered and administered vast territories that would later bear his name: northern and southern Rhodesia, today Zambia and Zimbabwe. Rhodes embodied the ambition of Victorian imperialism. In his vision, Africa was a field of economic opportunities and a laboratory for the expansion of British civilization. He founded mining companies such as De Beers, which monopolized diamond extraction in South Africa and promoted colonization through treaties and coercion. His motto, "The empire's destiny is to rule the world," summarized the spirit of his time. The southern part of the continent witnessed one of the empire's toughest conflicts, the Boer Wars. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers established since the 17th century, had founded independent republics inland, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, where gold and diamonds were discovered. London, determined to control these resources, intervened militarily. The First Boer War, between 1880 and 1881, ended with a humiliating British defeat. However, in the Second Boer War, from 1899 to 1902, the Crown deployed its full military machinery. The conflict was brutal. The Boers employed guerrilla tactics, and the British responded with total war. Farms were burned, entire families deported, and the first modern concentration camps were established, where thousands of women and children died. The British victory, though costly, secured control of the rich mines of the Transvaal and laid the foundation for the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910 under British rule. Meanwhile, in the West, Britain consolidated its influence in Nigeria, the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, and Sierra Leone. These colonies became centers for the production of palm oil, cocoa, and minerals. Colonial administration was based on a system of indirect rule. Local chiefs retained their nominal authority but obeyed the orders of British officials. It was an efficient form of control, less costly than direct occupation but equally relentless. By the late 19th century, British presence in Africa extended across nearly all the key regions. From Cairo to the Cape, the continent appeared shadowed by the imperial flag. Ports, roads, and railways were constructed, always with the same purpose: to facilitate the extraction of resources and the movement of troops. Colonial borders divided peoples and cultures, imposing new languages, religions, and economic systems. The moral justification for African imperialism was framed in the language of progress and civilization. Christian missionaries accompanied merchants and soldiers, founding schools and hospitals that spread British culture while also dismantling ancestral social structures. Africans were considered subjects, not citizens, and their labor sustained the colonial economies. By 1900, Britain controlled territories in over 20 African regions, occupying nearly a fifth of the continent. Rhodes's dream of an empire from the Cape to Cairo seemed within reach. Africa, with its natural wealth and strategic position, had become a central piece of the imperial machinery. However, that dominance would not last forever. Social tensions, indigenous uprisings, and rivalries with other European powers foreshadowed a future of conflict. Beneath the apparent calm of the Pax Britannica, the African continent simmered with resistance and resentment, awaiting its moment to break free from imperial yoke. Dominion in India, the jewel of the empire. Of all the territories under British rule, none held as much importance or symbolism as India. By the mid-19th century, the subcontinent was the economic, military, and cultural heart of the British Empire, the so-called jewel in the crown. With a population exceeding 200 million and a millennia-long history, India became the laboratory of colonial power, a territory where British commerce, politics, and culture intertwined in a network of near-total control. After the dissolution of the British East India Company in 1858, power officially passed to the British Crown. Parliament created the position of Viceroy of India, the direct representative of the monarch, and established an administrative system that combined British bureaucracy with local collaboration. London ruled through an elite of officials and military officers, but also through subordinated Indian princes known as Maharajas or Nawabs, who retained their titles and privileges in exchange for loyalty to the empire. It was a system of indirect rule, effective and calculated. India appeared autonomous, but every major decision was made in Whitehall. The Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 left a deep scar. The uprising, initiated by Indian soldiers in the colonial army, spread like wildfire across northern India and challenged British authority. Retaliation was brutal. Villages were burned, mass executions carried out, and exemplary punishments imposed. The message was clear: British authority would not be challenged. From then on, administration was reorganized under a policy of constant surveillance, supported by a colonial army of over 300,000 Indian soldiers under British command. British rule transformed India's economy. The free trade policies imposed by London destroyed the traditional textile industry, which for centuries had been the most advanced in the world. Manchester cotton fabrics displaced local textiles, leaving millions of artisans in poverty. In return, India was converted into a supplier of raw materials: cotton, jute, tea, wheat, opium, and spices. Plantations, mines, and factories were controlled by British companies, while the railway system, designed to transport goods to ports, served the interests of imperial commerce. The railway was the symbol of the new colonial order. With over 40,000 kilometers of tracks built by the end of the 19th century, it connected previously isolated regions, facilitating the movement of troops, goods, and officials. Alongside trains, the telegraph and maritime lines linked India to the rest of the empire, allowing London to communicate directly with Calcutta within hours. It was technology in the service of domination. Indian society underwent a process of forced transformation. The British imposed their language, laws, and education. Universities were founded in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, where a new class of Indians, educated in English, learned philosophy, science, and administration according to Victorian values. Many of them, however, began to question the legitimacy of colonial power and develop a sense of national consciousness. The seed of Indian nationalism was planted within the empire's own schools. The judicial system introduced the concept of equality before the law, but in practice, justice remained unequal. British officials were immune to local courts, and racial hierarchies shaped all social relations. In cities, segregation was evident: exclusive neighborhoods for Europeans, reserved clubs, and separate transportation. The empire justified itself under the idea of enlightened despotism, according to which Britain had the mission to civilize and modernize colonial peoples. Agriculture was also subordinated to British interests. The tax collection system forced peasants to pay part of their harvest in cash, compelling them to incur debts with lenders. During droughts, the lack of food reserves caused devastating famines. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 affected southern India, causing the deaths of 5 to 10 million people. Despite this, the colonial government maintained grain exports to Britain. The empire viewed India as a source of income, not a nation to prosper. British control also transformed the urban landscape. Cities such as Calcutta, Delhi, and Bombay were filled with wide avenues, neoclassical buildings, monumental railway stations, and colonial residences. The Victoria Memorial in Calcutta and the palaces of the British Raj in New Delhi symbolized the grandeur of imperial rule. Architecture, education, and art became instruments of legitimacy. Everything reflected order, discipline, and British authority. Politically, the second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of the first opposition movements. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded, initially composed of moderate intellectuals seeking reforms within the colonial system. Although they initially advocated cooperation with the British, their existence marked the beginning of organized nationalism. Over time, demands for participation would evolve into calls for independence. Meanwhile, the empire continued to use India as its military base. Indian soldiers participated in wars across Asia, Africa, and Europe, serving as an auxiliary force for the crown. The country became a pillar of the imperial system, both for its size and its wealth. Without India's labor, resources, and obedience, the British Empire would have been unsustainable. British culture penetrated even everyday life. Milk tea, cricket, Western clothing, and the English language mixed with local traditions, creating a hybrid identity that still persists. But beneath this appearance of harmony, tensions grew. London's imperial pride rested on inequality and repression. The jewel of the empire shone brightly, but its radiance concealed millions of lives subjected to the will of a foreign power. By the end of the 19th century, India was the perfect example of British power. A vast territory governed from afar, a population subordinated to a foreign minority, and an economy serving a distant metropolis. The Union Jack flew over the palaces of Delhi, the ports of Bombay, and the fields of Bengal. The jewel of the empire was firmly set in the British crown, but its brilliance was beginning to show cracks that would, over time, shake the foundations of colonial rule. The Pacific and Oceania. British domination in the Pacific arose from a mix of opportunity, punishment, and ambition. At the end of the 18th century, when English prisons were overcrowded and the American colonies no longer received convicts, the London government sought a remote territory to establish penal colonies. The explorations of Captain James Cook, who travelled across Oceania between 1768 and 1779, provided the answer: the vast coasts of Australia. In 1788, 11 ships departed from Portsmouth carrying over 700 prisoners, sailors, and soldiers. This voyage, known as the First Fleet, arrived at Botany Bay, where Sydney, the first permanent European settlement in Australia, was founded. The territory was arid and unfamiliar, inhabited by Aboriginal peoples who had lived there for millennia. Colonization radically altered their way of life. Disease, forced displacement, and violence accompanied British expansion. Within a few decades, settlers replaced convicts as the main inhabitants, driven by agriculture, livestock farming, and later by the gold rush of the 1850s. Control of Australia was not only penal, but also strategic. Its position in the South Pacific offered a foothold between Asia and America. The colonies of New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia, and Tasmania evolved into self-sufficient economies. In 1901, they were unified under the name of the Commonwealth of Australia, an autonomous dominion within the British Empire that remained loyal to the Crown. At the same time, the British turned their eyes to New Zealand, a fertile land with a temperate climate promising prosperity. In 1840, the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi between British representatives and Maori chiefs nominally recognized the rights of the natives, but in practice it served to legitimize British sovereignty. The massive arrival of European settlers provoked armed conflicts known as the Maori Wars, which ended with the defeat of the indigenous population and the consolidation of British rule. Other Pacific islands, such as Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, were annexed as protectorates or minor colonies throughout the 19th century. Their value lay both in natural resources, such as sugar, coconut pulp, and timber, and in their geopolitical location. The British established trade and missionary networks that transformed local cultures. Christianity, the English language, and Western administrative structures replaced ancestral traditions. The British Pacific was a mosaic of colonies, dominions, and protectorates connected by maritime trade and cultural expansion. Unlike Asia or Africa, the colonies of Oceania were seen as extensions of the United Kingdom, territories where the British could emigrate, found cities, and reproduce their lifestyle. However, this New England of the Southern Hemisphere was built on the dispossession of indigenous peoples who were marginalized or exterminated in the name of progress. By the end of the 19th century, Britain had secured its hegemony in the region. Its naval bases in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands guaranteed control over the routes to India and China. The ocean became an imperial bridge connecting the ends of the world under a single flag. On contemporary maps, the Pacific was dotted with red points. Each represented a port, garrison, or British colony. British rule in Oceania was less bloody than in Asia or Africa, but equally decisive for the balance of the empire. From the beaches of Sydney to the mountains of New Zealand, the British world extended beyond imagination, reinforcing the illusion of an eternal empire where the sun truly never set. The Empire and the World Wars. The 20th century brought the greatest challenge the British Empire had ever faced. The two world wars tested not only its military power, but also its unity. Colonies, dominions, and protectorates became essential components of the war machine, providing men, raw materials, and economic resources. The empire, at its greatest extent, was also more fragile than ever. During World War I, millions of soldiers from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand fought under the British flag. On the Western Front, colonial regiments mixed with troops from the British Isles. At Gallipoli, Australian and New Zealand forces, known as the ANZACS, suffered enormous losses that shaped their national identities. India sent over 1 million soldiers and tons of supplies, while Africa provided troops, food, and strategic minerals. The war left Britain victorious but exhausted. Its economy was heavily in debt, and nationalist movements began to spread throughout the empire. In Ireland, Egypt, and India, demands for autonomy became unstoppable. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 granted Britain new territories under mandate, such as Palestine, Iraq, and parts of Africa. But the burden of maintaining them was growing increasingly heavy. During World War II, the situation repeated itself with even greater intensity. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Dominions responded immediately. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India joined the war effort. The colonies supplied oil, rubber, food, and millions of soldiers. The empire functioned as a global logistical network. However, the war also revealed its limits. Japan advanced into the Asian colonies, capturing Singapore in 1942, which struck a blow to British pride and shattered the myth of its invulnerability. The end of the conflict marked a turning point. Although Britain emerged as one of the victorious powers, its economic and political power was weakened. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as new superpowers, and the British Empire, indebted and exhausted, began to crumble. In 1947, the independence of India, followed by the partition creating Pakistan, sealed the beginning of the end. The jewel in the crown was gone, along with the empire's foundation. The wars had demonstrated the strength of the imperial spirit, but also its anachronism. The peoples who had fought for Britain now demanded their freedom. In the following decades, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean would embark on an unstoppable path of emancipation. The empire had won the wars but lost its raison d'être. Decolonization and the end of British rule. After 1945, the world map began to change rapidly. The post-war period brought a new international order in which colonialism no longer had a place. Pressure from the United States, the influence of the United Nations, and local nationalist movements pushed Britain to grant independence to most of its territories. The process began in Asia, with the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947, followed by Burma and Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. In the 1950s, the momentum shifted to Africa. Ghana became the first African country to gain independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah. It was followed by Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan, Tanzania, and Zambia. In many cases, the transition was peaceful. In others, such as Kenya or Malaysia, violence marked the path to sovereignty. In the Caribbean, islands gradually gained independence or joined autonomous systems. In the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand were already functioning as independent nations, bound to the crown only by symbolic ties. In the Middle East, the British withdrawal from Palestine in 1948 gave rise to the State of Israel and a conflict that continues to this day. Decolonization was not only political. It meant the collapse of an economic system that had sustained the empire for centuries. Trade routes fragmented, colonial companies lost their monopolies, and London ceased to be the absolute financial center of the world. Nevertheless, Britain managed to maintain some influence through the creation of the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of sovereign countries sharing historical ties, language, and economic cooperation. However, the loss of the empire left a profound mark on British identity. The following decades were characterized by imperial nostalgia and the search for a new role in the world. Joining the European Economic Community in 1973 was seen as an attempt to replace the old empire with a new form of integration. The last tangible symbol of colonial power disappeared with the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. With it, a historical cycle that had begun 4 centuries earlier, when Elizabeth I's corsairs sailed the seas in search of gold and glory, came to an end. The British Empire had dominated the planet for over 200 years, leaving behind an ambivalent legacy: progress and exploitation, science and violence, civilization and domination. Its fall was not sudden, but a gradual dissolution in a world that could no longer be governed from a single island. When the sun finally set on the last colonial territory, the echo of the empire remained in the language, institutions, and memory of the peoples who had once been part of it.